Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching the Dubio show. Actually, we're having the broadcast this afternoon from Cyprus, but we have with us a guest that comes from Australia. So a lot of people that are watching us from Cyprus, Greece, Europe, Australia, of course, United States, Iran, and UK. It's a very special edition of the show that we're going to discuss about Iran and Armenian minority in Iran. We have with us Dr. James Berry from Australia. That he's actually fluent in Farsi and Armenian. He studied the minority of Armenians in Iran. He's been in Iran. He's very famous for his publications about the whole issue and, of course, the political issues in Middle East and Iran. And today we're going to have this kind of interesting discussion that actually, James, as I explained, we have received something like 64, 65 questions, and people, they are very excited learning about Armenians in Iran and Iran. Welcome to our show in Cyprus.
Thank you, Paulina.
So, James, just an introduction to our people. You study international relations and anthropology, and where are you now? Where are you sitting now?
I'm in Melbourne. I'm in my home in Melbourne. Of course, we have, like everywhere else, COVID outbreaks, so we don't come into the office so much. But it's 6 a.m. in the morning here, so it's also quite early. Yes, I did my dissertation. My dissertation research was on minorities in Iran, and the case study being the Armenian Christians of Iran. And so that required me to learn Persian and Armenian, to go to Iran to do field work. And my original discipline background was anthropology. Anthropology of language, anthropology of politics, or political anthropology. Although gradually, because of the nature of academia in Australia, which tends to see Middle Eastern studies more as a political science issue than an anthropological issue, most of the positions, if not all the positions I've had since 2013, 2014, when I started working in research-only roles, have been in political science and international relations. So I've done projects on Iran's international relations, mostly regional, its own region that is, with Central Asia and surrounding countries. But yeah, my background is anthropology, and I work in international relations.
James, you've been in Iran. How long did you stay there?
So the first time I was there for 6 months. Due to the nature of the sanctions regime, I had to take all my currency with me. And of course, due to international laws on how much you can travel without being taxed or raising suspicion, there was a limit on that. And so I stayed for 6 months the first time, and I stayed in Tehran primarily. And so an anthropologist usually likes to spend upwards to 12 months the first time in a field site. I wasn't able to do that, unfortunately. However, I have had the privilege of being able to go back a number of times for 1 to 2 months at a time. So that has helped give me a fuller picture and revisit questions that I had about the field. But my initial area was the Armenian community of Tehran. So I was more or less looking only at that community, how they fitted into the fabric of society, how they saw their role in society, but also how day-to-day life for Armenians in Iran took place. And that was the subject of my dissertation, and later became the subject of my book, which was very different from previous studies on Armenians in Iran, which have tended to focus on bigger picture issues, such as the politics of the Armenian community during several critical junctures, like the constitutional revolution of Iran, and the role of the Armenians in the Safavid era, in the economy of the Safavid era, and in art and other contributions to Iranian society. So in many ways, what I looked at was far more banal. It was more about the day-to-day life of people who Armenians who live in Iran. And so in some ways, my work has come across as quite strange to those who work in the area of Iranian Armenians in particular, because it's different that way.
So James, we have the Armenian community in Tehran, but we have also a big community in Isfahan. So what is the number of the Armenian community all over Iran at the moment?
I don't know what the current official number is, but the official number is always higher than the actual number, because the way that the census works in Iran, they don't differentiate between Christian groups. So they have, I think, a number of people who are nominated as Christians every census, but the vast majority of them would not be Armenians. Many of them would be Iranians who either adopted Christianity, which is illegal, of course, but they still put that in the census, or other groups that don't want to. Well, other groups like Baha'is who put Zoroastrian or Christian down as their religion because they can't put Baha'i as their religion. These are just two examples. So the Armenian. Sorry, go on.
So actually, the number that we have about Armenians is not actually about Armenians. It's about other. It's only also about the other groups that they are just amended and incorporated into the number of the Christians and Armenians in Iran.
In the census, yes, but the Armenian community itself, I think, in recent years was saying 60 to 80,000, whereas the census was saying 120,000. This is in the past like 5 years or so. It may have changed now. I haven't looked lately. When I was last there, though, the general number that Armenians gave was 20 to 25,000 in all of Iran, which may be a pessimistic number, because if you travel to Tehran or Isfahan and you visit Armenian communities, it seems like there are a lot of Armenians there. But by they, I mean many of the interlocutors who I spoke to over several years, they said the number was in decline. In 2010, the number was 30,000 or 35,000 at most. And then after the financial crisis that happened in 2011, 2012, 2013, a number of members of the community left. And by 2015, the community was telling me 20 to 25,000 were left in all of Iran.
So James, I mean, when I've been there, I saw the Armenian community in Tehran, in Isfahan. Where else exists the Armenian community in Iran?
They used to live all throughout Iran, mostly in rural areas, in Armenian villages, particularly in the center and the south of Iran, but also strongly in the northwest, in the Iranian Azerbaijan province, around Salmas, Khoi, Maku, Tabriz, Urumiyeh, these places. They were very strong, and also in the Caspian area as well, and villages around Qarqan and around Isfahan, Jahar Mahal Bakhtiari, and so forth. In the 20th century, most of the community urbanized, and they urbanized into large centers like Tabriz, Tehran, Isfahan. And Isfahan used to be the largest Armenian population until the mid-20th century, when Tehran eclipsed it because it was the capital. Isfahan, of course, has a historically large Armenian community because of the Safavid deportations of Armenians, and Isfahan was the capital during that period, and so the center of the Armenian community was in Isfahan. And Tehran only, which became the capital during the Qajar era around about 1800, the Armenian community only became the larger Armenian community in the 1950s with urbanization. Tabriz also still has quite a large, or not large, but significant Armenian community, as does Urumiyeh, particularly the neighborhood of Haftvon, which is an old village, which is part of the city, and a few other scattered areas around Iranian Azerbaijan province. There are Armenian communities.
How come there is an Armenian community in Iran, in the sense why there was this immigration to Iran of Armenians?
Well, for many reasons, and there have been many migrations. There has always been an Armenian presence in the area that we now know as Iran, and historically the area that was known as Iran, to the point where the border between what Armenians consider their historic homeland and what is considered historic Iran, they overlap, much like Kurdistan. Other historic homelands overlap with each other because of the nature of the multi-ethnic, multilingual areas. So the northwest of Iran, around that area, Salmas, Khoi, near the border with Armenia and near the border with Turkey, was always heavily populated with Armenians, and the language, the province of Vaspuragan in historic Armenia did stretch down to Lake Urumiyeh. So those Armenians tend to think of themselves, or are talked about by other Armenians, as indigenous to Iran. And the other migrations, the most famous, of course, is in the early 1600s, when Shah Abbas was fighting in the Caucasus against the Ottomans, where he led mass deportations as part of a scorched earth campaign, which included Armenians, Georgians, and others, and forced those communities to march into Iran and eventually settle, and then also prevented them from returning. He moved entire merchant communities en masse intact to Isfahan, and that did allow those communities to prosper, sometimes with royal favor, and become very wealthy and develop Iran's trading network in India, throughout Asia, as far as Mexico. Several Aslanyan's book showed that they made it as far as the Philippines and Mexico, but also north to Russia, to Latvia, into the Western Europe and other places.
James, this population has been adapted. I mean, being in Iran and talking to Armenians, I found it very fascinating that, for example, in Isfahan, there is the Museum of Genocide. So Iran was one of the first countries that recognized the genocide against Armenians by Turkish. So they have also there the museum. And it was very, very nice for me when I was there. I have seen that the Armenians, between them, they do speak Armenian, but also they speak Farsi.
Yes.
So how I saw that they are fully incorporated into the state and the society. And when I was around the Armenian neighborhood, because we're also Christian Orthodox, of course, they felt very nice that we are Greeks and we were there. It was very lovely for them. They invited us to their homes. We tried a lot of traditional stuff. But they gave me the sense that it's a part, is their land, so they don't find it that is something, it's a foreign state, and they don't feel comfortable. So I found them feeling not indigenous, but feeling comfortable living in Iran.
It's a very complicated relationship, like many different ethnic minority groups around the world. So there is a general discourse in Iran, both by Armenians and by non-Armenians, by the majority population, that looks at Armenians as foreigners in the sense that they have only been in Iran for a couple of hundred years. But they call them migrants, even though the migration happened mostly 400 years ago. And this is internalized by some Armenians, or many Armenians in Iran. Although in recent times, there's a trend within the Armenian community to reject that and say we're citizens of Iran, so we're Iranians. Our ethnicity, our language is part of being Iranian. Iranians don't all speak the one language and have the one religion or the one way of being. They do speak Persian, Farsi. That's in recent decades, in the past 100 years, with the ending of ghettos and village life, the Armenian community, which used to be very monolingual, very Armenian speaking, not just Armenian speaking, but their own dialects, regional dialects, they became more Persian speaking. And the Armenian that was spoken in Iran suddenly became a little bit more standardized as well. Although it's very distinctly, there's a very distinct Iranian Armenian accent and vocabulary and dialect. They standardized a bit. But of course, it's also famous, the Armenian community is famous for their accent when they speak Persian. Now, not all Armenians in Iran have that accent, but it generally is a sign of Armenian people who have been raised mostly within the community setting. They've gone to Armenian schools, and even in Armenian schools where the majority of the teaching is done in Persian, the actual communication in the class is in Armenian. So they have an accent which...
Are they allowed to be taught in Armenia as well? Do they have Armenian language courses?
They do. There's certain classes that are taught in Armenian. Religious studies are taught in Armenian. History of Armenian literature is taught in Armenian. But there was a strong limit after the revolution on how many hours they could actually teach in Armenian, which leads to a situation where many Iranian Armenians of that generation after the revolution speak Armenian fluently, but they can't read and write Armenian very well because most of their written education is in Persian. However, something that they would say to they're leaving a note to a family member, something like I'm going out for dinner, I'll see you later. Rather than writing it in Armenian, they'll write it in Persian. Though if they were to communicate with that person rather than writing a note, they would use Armenian. So they tend to write in Persian and speak in Armenian. It's, I guess, the result of the education system.
James, how is the feeling? Do those people feel that we belong to Armenia, or are we Iranians, but we are also Armenians? What is the feeling?
Like many diaspora groups, it's a bit of both, but also neither entirely. So, yes, you'll have Armenians who say that Armenia is the homeland. But when they say Armenia in that context, they don't mean the Republic of Armenia or the Republic of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh per se. They mean historically this entity known as Armenia, which stretched into eastern Turkey, parts of Georgia, parts of Iran, and so forth. So that's the historic homeland. But they do relate to the Republic of Armenia as a kind of home, while also recognizing that most Armenians from Armenia, who are known as Hayastansis, that they are very different to Iranian Armenians and other diaspora Armenians, in the sense that their culture has been affected by Soviet rule, Russian rule, and so forth. But one final important point, though, is the Armenian community members, particularly leadership, are very eager to stress to me that they are Iranian citizens and not citizens of Armenia. And in the event of any conflict with Iran and Armenia, which there hasn't been any, they have very cordial relations, they would be Iranian first. And some of the community leadership, secular leadership in particular, would complain that the Armenian embassy seemed to have an attitude that they were Armenian citizens, not Iranian citizens. Now, I don't know the context of those interactions. This is just what people talking around me would say. But they were worried that they didn't want to be accused of being more members of Armenia than Iran. They wanted to say, no, we are Iranians. We live here. We're born here. We pay our taxes here.
Yeah, actually, for me, it was also very, very crucial when I have seen, it was during my PhD thesis, when I saw some of the archives of the people that they fought the Iran-Iraq war. So I have seen that the Armenians, they've been in that war in 1980 from 1980 to 88. And actually, they fought there. Some of them, they've been volunteers. And even now that they found the bodies after so many years, the ceremony that they attend the ceremonies, and we see the Iranian officials and the Iranian generals, they go to the church and they're having the same praises and the same awards like all other Iranians. So the Iranian state, to this perspective, it doesn't differentiate if the one that fought for the country to also a Persian speaking or an Armenian speaking or a Jewish speaking. I mean, those people that they fought at the war, they receive the same praises like everywhere. And also, I have seen some speeches of Ayatollah say that we are one people, and our people and the people that they fought for the country, they belong to this country. Mm-hmm. And also, we have seen on Christmas Day, Ayatollah is going to the people, to the houses, and is sharing some of their traditional stuff, and it prays with them, showing a kind of respect to the Armenian community.
Yes. So, like in many countries, war is a great leveler. So ethnic or religious differences that occur in peacetime suddenly aren't relevant when the country is under threat. Same as in my country, where Indigenous Australians who were discriminated against still today, that they were treated as equals in the army because they were needed as such. And same with African Americans in the American army and so forth. To an extent, I understand that I'm maybe generalizing. So Armenians, Jews, Sunni Muslims, they all joined up the same as everybody else during that war because the country was under threat. They were conscripted as well, and they fought and they died or were badly injured as a result. And there are many veterans in Iran for that. There is a monument to Armenian victims in Tehran, in the Catholic Church, the Armenian Catholic Church. And every year on the Hafteye Defaa Moqaddas, the Week of the Holy Defense, which is the commemoration of the war, the Armenian community very much gets behind that, and they have their own private ceremonies, the church ceremonies, as well as they participate in the larger ceremonies of the country. And it's true, the Iranian government finds this the easiest way to engage with the Armenian community. Now, the Armenian community are a minority, they're not Muslim, but they're generally regarded positively as a minority in Iran. There are positive stereotypes about them. And as you mentioned, the president and, Rouhani particularly, and Ayatollah Khamenei tend to visit Armenian families of martyrs, those who were killed during the war, the parents usually during that time. However, it does show that the Iranian government, while it tries to show respect to the Armenian community, doesn't quite understand them, because they do this on Christmas Day, the Western Christmas Day, the 25th of December, which, as many of us know, the Armenians celebrate Christmas on the 6th of January. They celebrate, they use the Gregorian calendar, but they celebrate Christmas and Epiphany together, which is an ancient tradition. So they still don't quite understand the community. I think that it does show it, but it's also fitting that the Armenian community is open to the gesture regardless, and they don't stand there and say, "Oh, well, actually, this is not our Christmas." They do appreciate the gesture. It's very important because, I mean, the sacrifice was felt by families. And if you go to Armenian neighborhoods in Iran, you'll see street signs, streets that are named after these martyrs, people who died during the Iran-Iraq War, murals to them. They still have them today. So it's very important. And it's very important to Iranians in general. Though generation now is growing up without the memory of the war, those who lived through it, it is one of the, they'll tell you, it's one of the most horrible experiences of their life, even if they weren't soldiers, just dealing with the constant bombing and the constant bad news and fear. So yeah, it's very important.
James, do they have a constitutional obligation nowadays, Armenians, to serve in the army in Iran?
Yep, as citizens of Iran, they are obliged to do military service. I don't know what that's been reduced to now. I think it's still 18 months or 2 years. Every male between the ages of 18, after the age of 18, is required. However, like other Iranians, they try to avoid it because military service in Iran is, they're trying to reform it. I mean, it was part of the debates in the Iranian parliament last year, even though it's a sensitive issue. It's considered to be a waste of time for a lot of people. It's you're taken from your family home, you're far away, and often they don't have much for soldiers to do. So they end up directing traffic. And if you've traveled in Tehran and other places, you may have actually seen people directing traffic who are military conscripts. There are always rumors that minorities are treated badly in the military. And there are stories that what they call Hezbollahi or more fanatical regime supporters will tell Christians and non-Muslims that they can't eat in the same places or drink from the same taps as Muslims, which comes from the Shia tradition of najes, that non-Muslims are unclean. And people have talked about that to me, but more or less Armenians who I know who have served in the army, so they had no experience of that, Armenians tend not to have any problems. Other minorities, such as Yarsan, the Yarsani, who are a minority group from mostly Kurdish regions, and of course Baha'is, they would be targeted a bit more, but Armenians less so. However, like many other Iranians, they either try to stay in education until their father reaches a certain age, if they are the eldest son, so they don't have to do military service, or they perform military service in another country if they're dual citizens. But to be honest, if you're going to choose, say, between Armenia, which, you know, Armenians in Iran as a diaspora group can go and serve in the army in Armenia, you're better off doing a military service in Iran if you are, because of just the danger. You know, the Armenians have been at war with Azerbaijan for more than 30 years, and that's a real war. As we saw 2 years ago, there was an all-out war as a result of that. So, and the Armenian military is known as reputation for being much more brutal in how they treat recruits than the Iranian military. But yes, they are required to do military service, and many of them do it.
James, how they're organized from the political sense? Do the Armenians, they are very close to the church, so the church they gives it's having a decision-making role? Do they have political parties, political organizations? Do they have youth organizations? How does the Iranian state react to the political organizations of Armenians?
So they have many organizations in Iran, secular and religious, and some are state funded. So the Iranian constitution recognizes three minorities, four minorities. Armenian and Assyrian Christians form two separate categories, Jews and Zoroastrians. And they're all guaranteed their own courts for family law, and they're all guaranteed their own seat in parliament. Armenians have two because historically they were quite a large community. So in one for the north, or Tehran and Tabriz, and one for the south, Isfahan. So there are representatives of Armenian representatives in the parliament. Historically, the politics of the community was very divided. There was a divide between left-wing Armenians who were more interested in an integrated Iran, a left-wing Iran where religion and language meant less or nothing, or everyone was equal. And then you have the Dashnak Sutyun, or the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which started as a left-wing group in the Caucasus, but after the First World War really became a strong right-wing nationalist group. In the course of the 20th century, both under the Shah's era and then later after the revolution, leftists were repeatedly suppressed. So the Dashnak Sutyun are the dominant political faction politically in the Armenian community today. Even though many people are not members of that group, they do dominate a lot of the organizations and the seats in parliament and so forth.
And actually, James, as I remember, they participated also in the Constitutional Revolution partly.
Yes, and back then they were a left-wing group. The Dashnak Sutyun and the Unchagagan, two political parties which originated in the Caucasus and in the Ottoman Empire. They were very active in the Constitutional Revolution, cooperating with the Social Democrats, the Iranian Social Democrats, who are one of the early political parties in Iran and one of the main constitutional parties in Iran. The Dashnak Sutyun have a very close relationship with the church as well. So they have a very symbiotic relationship with each other. But I should stress that in Iran, because of this taboo around political parties technically aren't illegal, but then they kind of are as well. It's a bit of an ambiguous zone. So they don't tend to call themselves a political party, the Dashnaks. They kind of call themselves they just say they're an organization or a philosophy or so forth. But they do have a close relationship with the church. And of course, the church has a big standing. It's a religious state. So the archbishop and church in general are viewed as parties to communicate to government with. And so they often meet with senior government figures, and they also meet with the religious leaders in Iran to talk about issues affecting the Armenian community, sometimes accompanied by members of parliament and sometimes not.
James, how does the Iranian state react into that? Do they feel comfortable having Armenians into a political faction, and this political faction to influence the Armenian population in Iran?
Yes, they don't seem to mind political factions that are willing to go along with the status quo. So the Dashnak Sutyun, they like the status quo because it's easier to separate the Armenian community from the rest of the society, and the government of Iran and the Islamic Republic system creates a separate category for them. So they have their own education system. They can keep to themselves. They can form clubs where they have more freedoms than the rest of the population.
Is there an Armenian TV or Armenian language video, radio?
I don't know about radio. There's not a television from my knowledge either, because they have satellite TV from Armenia. They tend to use that, which does often cover Iranian Armenians as well. And in the United States, of course, there's Irana High TV, which is an Iranian Armenian web channel. But that said, they have their own newspapers, a very strong history in publishing in Iran. So there's Alik, which is a Dashnak newspaper, Araks, which is a left-wing newspaper, and a few other publications like Huis, which are more magazine publications that are available to Armenians. And there are some that are published in Persian, which are more open to introducing the community to the wider Iranian society, like Behman. So they do have a lot available to them. And yeah, when they consume Armenian TV shows or films, it tends to be from Armenia, which is interesting because that also influences the way that Armenian is now spoken in Iran. Like the traditional way of saying "How are you?" The vonses, which they say in Yerevan, you hear that in Iran now. So maybe it's been that way for a while, but I just think it's interesting that these very archetypal Armenian from Armenia type of speaking has also been adopted throughout the diaspora, not just in Iran. Sorry. But yeah, that's more or less how it works. But there's no shortage of cultural events either for Armenians to go to. There's an Italian language club for Armenians in Tehran. There's sports as well. There's lots of, because it's a historically large community, very well organized with a lot of resources. There are a lot of opportunities available for Armenians to pursue their hobbies in a solely Armenian environment if they so choose.
James, how do the Armenians understand the other three minorities. We have the Jews, the Assyrians, and the Zoroastrians. How do they go along with the other three major minorities in Iran?
Well, they have a lot of contact on a general basis with the Assyrian community because they're both Christian. And they sometimes share events, especially in the northwest of Iran, those smaller communities like Haftan or Urumiyeh, where the Assyrian community is quite large, and you do see intermarriage, and you see Armenians who can speak Assyrian and vice versa. The Jewish community and the Zoroastrian community generally, from my experience, keep to themselves much more. And they, on an official level, the head rabbi of the Jewish community, the head priest of the Zoroastrian community, and the Christian leaders will all get together very frequently to show a solidarity with each other as minorities. The same is true for members of parliament, minority members of parliament. But on a day-to-day level, these communities don't mix as much because they're quite different from each other. And Jews and Zoroastrians in particular are very much more Iranian in the sense that they are Persian speakers as their own language. They might have a few words which are different, what they use with each other. And I know that in Yazd, the Zoroastrian community has their own dialect or sociolect, and Jews traditionally did as well, but they don't anymore. So Armenians speaking a different language, Assyrians speaking a different language, they tend to not mix with Persian speakers the same way that Jews and Zoroastrians do. The Jewish community also, I mean, Armenians have said to me, the Zoroastrian community is regarded very well by Iranian society in general because they're seen as the most Iranian group. They're true Iranians, the original religion. Whereas the Jewish community, because of the enmity between Israel and Iran, is always under pressure. And even though most Iranians that you meet, they can tell the difference between a Jewish person and an Israeli person, it doesn't stop others from harassing or bothering Jewish members of the community every time the news is talking about the treatment of Palestinians. So there's a lot more pressure on the Jewish community as a result. And they have been subject to more policing, including arrest and executions in the past couple of decades than the Armenian community has.
Well, actually, I meet some Iranian Jewish. I cannot see that they feel this kind of pressure. I think mostly for them, it's that they have a kind of complex identity issue, because for them it's very clear that we are Jewish but we are Iranians, but it doesn't seem this for the people, not for the state so much, but for the people. So I think that in my opinion, what I have seen talking with them is that they feel mostly social pressure from other people, and while they say yes, we want to be inducted and we want to go along with other Iranians, they feel that they isolated from the very beginning, said that we are Jewish. And actually, I have seen some Iranian Jews there that they don't really speak Hebrew. So they are just Persian speakers, but they feel this kind of pressure, but they say that we feel social pressure, that state pressure. Of course, there is a kind of state pressure, but it's not so obvious in most of the times.
They've had some problems with the Iranian government in being taken seriously, I think. Like up until the Rouhani era, they were forced to open their schools on Saturdays. And then Rouhani changed the law that they didn't have to do that. For those who aren't aware, the Iranian week starts on Saturday and runs through till middle of Thursday. It's a 5.5-day week. So that was a big change. That took more than 30 years for that to happen, or 25 years. The other issue was the Hebrew, actually. So, of course, like many Jewish communities, they're not Hebrew speaking, but they do need to learn Hebrew for reading their religious texts. And I've been in synagogues in Iran. Synagogues are like any synagogue anywhere that's so-called Orthodox, I guess. I don't like to use the term Orthodox because it tends to give the wrong idea. But the entire Siddur, everything's in Hebrew. So you have to be able to read it and understand it. The Jewish community did complain for a long time that they weren't given enough time to teach Hebrew, and they'd often have to teach Hebrew after school so that they could learn. But at the same time, things that you would think about Iran, such as, look, if you walk past Jewish shops or Jewish centers in Iran, everything's written in Hebrew. And so you're in Iran, you have this idea that Israel is the enemy, and suddenly you see Hebrew written everywhere. You kind of understand that it's not so simple. In addition, the synagogues in
Yeah,
Iran.
actually, I have seen so many kosher restaurants in Iran that I was so shocked.
Yeah, yeah. There's at least one in Palestine Street, the Palestine Street in Tehran that I know of. But yeah, the synagogues as well. In Australia, for example, synagogues have guards on armed guards because of anti-Semitic attacks from Nazi groups and others. In Iran, there's no guards. You can just walk in and out. Now, synagogues in Iran, like older churches, are not visible from the street. Like very often, some of them are, but historically, religious minorities were by law not allowed to make their religious houses of worship visible to Muslims. So when you go to a synagogue, very often you wouldn't know that's what it is until you're actually inside the building. But that said, they don't have the gate is open. There aren't guards. There isn't that danger that you have in Western countries. So it's full of contradictions. Yeah, there has been a number of, in the last 10 years, when I was doing my research, there was 2 killings of Jewish members or members of the community that took place, which the community was quite upset about it because both cases, they were seen as crimes that were not taken seriously by the government because the victim was not Muslim. Yeah, so it's never a black or white issue with that community or any minority community.
So, discussing about Armenians, do the Armenians go often to Armenia, to the homeland of Armenia, or they just because they feel that we are so close, we just stay more in Iran and we feel comfortable with it?
They go to Armenia a lot, and I'm sure it's based on your circumstances and what you can afford. But as Iranian citizens, they have visa-free travel to Armenia, so they can fly there cheaply or travel there by bus. And so many of the people that I know, Armenians living in Iran, would travel sometimes twice a year, maybe even more, to visit Armenia. Part of it being that the cultural freedoms in Armenia are greater. The women don't have to cover their hair. The interaction of people is much more free, and they can consume alcohol and so forth in public without in open areas without there being a problem. So there's that, but also just for cultural reasons, they like to travel there. That said, though, it works both ways. They also bring people from Armenia to Iran to Armenian events. So senior members of government, of cultural ministries, of people from the Genocide Museum, they bring them to Iran. So they are able to get some of the knowledge that's coming out of Armenia face to face in Tehran, for example. So there's a lot of interaction between the two countries, and some go there to live or study because they know the language. It's a lot easier. Though they do get the shock when they go there that because of Russian influence, the Armenian language in Armenia, as well as the day-to-day life, is very Russian influenced, and you have to know a bit of Russian really to fully integrate into the society. And that's one of the biggest challenges, that a lot of Armenians in Armenia speak Russian, even though they've been raised since the Soviet Union. So they often do speak Russian, or they use Russian words, though often in Armenicized Russian words, which is a jargon that's confusing if you aren't familiar with it. So that's something that all diaspora Armenians have to face if they travel to Armenia.
James, until now we have seen that Iran and Armenia, they had a quite loyal relationship, and the reason it was that Iran wanted to stop Azerbaijan and Turkey in order to take over Caucasus, and from the other perspective, of course, is still Iran trusts that Azerbaijan is a part of Iran, and Azerbaijan they are all Persian tribes. But from the other perspective, also there are some challenges from the part of Azerbaijan against Iran. And for example, there was a member of the parliament 4 months ago that was said that Iran will be wiped from the map. Recently, and I was quite surprised, but I was expecting that in the last conflict of 2020, we have seen Iran that is trying to approach Azerbaijan, and it had a quite neutral position. So it said that the territories of Artsakh and Karabakh, they are supposed to be given back to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijani government needs to respect the presence of Armenian inhabitants and populations. Of course, the territories that they were acquired by Azerbaijan belongs now to Azerbaijan, but they didn't really respect the population. Iran had a neutral relationship and tried to keep the balance between the two countries. But it was a few weeks ago that we have seen one of the ministers of Iran, Mr. Fazuli, that he landed instead of Baku in Artsakh. I mean, he visited Azerbaijan, but landing in Artsakh with Mahan Air that belongs to Iran. So we see a kind of change in the relationships and how Iran probably tries to prevent Azerbaijan from being totally far away from Iran. Iran needs to keep a kind of good relationship with Azerbaijan for economic perspective, political and geopolitical perspective. How do you see this position of Iran, and how does this affect its relationship with Armenia?
Iran, it's a very complicated and sensitive issue, Iran's relationship with Azerbaijan, because of all sorts of geopolitical and other reasons. Iran has been consistent in maintaining that they're neutral between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They've been consistent in also saying that they uphold the Azerbaijan, their territorial integrity regarding Karabakh. Although they have said that that doesn't mean removing the Armenian population from those areas. And they've also been consistent in tending behind the scenes to favor Armenia over Azerbaijan. And the reason is because Azerbaijan poses more of a security threat than Armenia does, whereas Armenia has been an avenue of trade outside of the sanctions regime. Because Azerbaijan is so closely linked to Turkey, and this has a lot to do with the way that Azerbaijani nationalism was developed, particularly during the Soviet era and then after. Azerbaijan is a close ally of Israel, which is Iran's #1 enemy, and Iran has accused Azerbaijan of allowing Israel to use Azerbaijani territory to attack Iran. And finally, Iran considers Azerbaijan to be a threat to the Azerbaijani population of Iran, which is maybe 25% of the population, who speak the same language. And this goes back to another problem, which is that the Azerbaijani government passively and sometimes actively supports separatism in Iran. And that's why you've tended to see in recent years Iranians kind of in reaction saying the opposite, saying, well, actually, Azerbaijan should be part of Iran because of the Treaty of Turkmenchai is no longer relevant, and they are historically Iranian. And of course, if you live in Iran or you've been in Iran, you hear the Azerbaijani language, and then you hear it as spoken in Azerbaijan, it sounds very Persian or Persianized, or it's very familiar, I guess is the point, as opposed to Istanbul Turkish. So that complicates things. After the war that happened in 2020, Iran was one of the biggest losers because they nearly lost the border with Armenia to begin with. They also found Turkey, who was a big rival, and Israel emboldened during that period of time. So they have been trying to claw back a little bit, find some space that's going to be able to maintain their relationship with Armenia, but also have a relationship with Azerbaijan that's not dictated to them, because the Azerbaijani government has been trying to dictate to the Iranian government about transport, for example. But now if you want to transport to Russia, you have to transport through Azerbaijan. There'll be no transport through Armenia. They've been stopping their buses, their trucks and everything else. Added to that is public opinion is against Iranian government policy. Public opinion in Iran supports Azerbaijan, both from ethnic Azeris in Iran, and I'm not saying that ethnic Azeris in Iran always support Azerbaijan, but they have sympathy because they can understand their language, they can understand their point of view, but also just the traditional tendency in Muslim countries to support other Muslim countries in conflict, regardless of what the conflict is about, is also present in Iran. And during that war, there were a lot of protests, and protests that were allowed by the government to take place, which were in support of Azerbaijan. So they're worried about that. And that's also come up in recent years where there's been politicians who played to Azeri-speaking supporter bases, and they've started to drum up material that sounds very pan-Turkist, very separatist, and so forth. And there's been a number of politicians, particularly in West Azerbaijan province, the Hazrat Porter family, the mayor of Urumqi, as well as a member of parliament for West Azerbaijan, have spoken about Azerbaijan as a separate country. Azerbaijan being Iranian Azerbaijan, it's a separate country from Iran. To get support from usually rural Azerbaijanis who don't speak Persian as well, who feel a little bit alienated from the capital. And that's quite a dangerous thing to do. The Supreme Leader has several times, Khamenei has spoken out against it, but it hasn't changed the situation. In the latest parliament, there is an Azeri faction. That's just the way that it's developed over time. So Iran faces a number of threats as a result of Azerbaijan, particularly now that Azerbaijan looks good to the world. They're strong. They beat Armenia. They won back their land. Now they've got a very highly organized and coordinated, stage-managed public persona for the president and for the family, and to make Azerbaijan to look like the Dubai of the Caucasus, and Baku is the Dubai of the Caucasus, and so forth. So there are a lot of problems coming for Iran.
I think that, James, Iran became a big loser after 2018 and the Caspian Sea Treaty, let's say, because how they make the regime is something between a lake and a sea, and it was mostly on favor from the oil and gas perspective for Azerbaijan and Russia. So the problem is that Azerbaijan, with the help, of course, of Israel, Turkey, and the United States, they're establishing new marinas, new cargo warehouses, and everything in Baku. So Baku is becoming the biggest port in the region, something that is in competition with everything around. And Baku is the only exit in order to transport goods and products from Caucasus and from Black Sea, even from Europe to China. I mean, it's the middle stop. So Iran is losing this kind of geopolitical positioning and also this economic positioning. But from the other perspective, we see that back in 1995, there was an agreement, a kind of memorandum between Iran and Erbakan, Islamist government in Turkey, and they draw a kind of gas pipe started from Iran through Turkey in order to give gas to Europe. So an Iranian gas that is going to be through Turkey to Europe. I think that due to sanctions, but also after the Abraham Accords, that Iran is getting more and more isolated, and Persian Gulf is becoming a closed area that neither Saudi Arabia nor Bahrain nor other countries, they are showing a big interest because they're transporting their power and influence to Red Sea in order to transport goods to West. We see that Iran is being isolated, and unfortunately, it seems that the only exit of Iran at the moment to the rest of the world is becoming Turkey. So this approach with Azerbaijan is having also a kind of survivor politics behind it, and of course, it's something bad for Iran to admit that we recognize Azerbaijan, and actually we are improving the ego of Azerbaijan in the region, especially after the conflict of 2020. But it's a matter of surviving. And from my perspective, I'm not so sure that Iran is doing the right thing. I think that Rouhani government dealt with the whole issue very bad, as usually. I mean, it was not the perfect government in the foreign policy. But I see that from Raisi perspective, probably Raisi is also trapped into this kind of agreements and this kind of movements of Rouhani's government. But the problem now that I see is coming back to Armenia is that Iran is investing to Azerbaijan. But from the other side, I don't see any kind of investments to Armenia. So, James, how do Armenians, they see this kind of change into the politics of Iran towards Azerbaijan? How do the Armenians in Armenia comment about it?
Well, it's not good. I mean, one of the things that Armenia learnt, the Republic of Armenia learnt quite brutally, and the Armenian world learnt quite brutally during that war, was how few friends that they actually had, and how their belief that they had the moral high ground meant absolutely nothing when it comes to competing economic, legal, and other interests in that region, because they got no support. And the country that many Armenians in Armenia relied upon, Russia, was never going to be a reliable. That it always been said that Russia plays all sides, and Russia did play all sides. And Russia also seems to.
Well, actually, James, why Pashinyan all the time he was expecting a coup, and this coup never happened.
Yeah, and Pashinyan, who's now well, he's not completely a pariah, but he it's in hindsight, it's seen that a number of his moves have really backfired. And one of them was that he did try to push the Karabakh issue in a way that was deliberately provocative to Azerbaijan. That said, Azerbaijan was always planning to retake that land. It's not a case of Pashinyan or no Pashinyan. Aliyev did come out during the war, and he did say that they saw the change in government in 2018 in Armenia as a provocation. I don't know, they use this term provocation all the time. But at the same time, they were already planning for many years, escalating the conflict to the point where it was obvious that eventually they were going to try and take their land back, take that land back. But yeah, that country, Armenia, things are not good there at the moment because they're also worried that they're actually going to lose their sovereign territory. This corridor through Syunik province, which is part of the peace agreement and always has been on the table, they are worried that Azerbaijan will just annex that area and make it part of Azerbaijan. Because Azerbaijan, and look, I'm not saying this is specifically something peculiar to Azerbaijani government. They have the policy or the idea of vai victus, woe to the vanquished. If you win in a war, you're going to have to push your advantage as far as possible because you're not going to have that advantage for very long. So you try to get as much out of it. And that also influences how they've been pushing Iran into trying getting Iran to agree to things which are not in Iran's interests. But because they can push that at this point in time. Now, Iran has changed its tune a little bit, and it's starting to negotiate more with countries that it's had bad relations with. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, they're all talking to each other now. And even though it's not a straightforward, happy relationship, and the increasing attacks on the Emirates from the Houthis, they see them as interlinked. The Emiratis see this as entirely interlinked with Iranian interference. And yeah, the Abraham Accords, this weird scenario where the foreign minister of the Emirates flies to Tehran to talk to the foreign minister, flies home and talks to the president of Israel. So there's a very strange situation going on. But I think it's because, like you said, the situation is delicate for Iran and they don't have an advantage at the moment. And I don't know if Raisi or any president really is going to push for an advantage or create a situation where you can have it.
I believe that Iran has a very bad miscalculation of its foreign policy. The problem is that it's a very strong country, of course, and it uses Islam in order to influence other populations from Tehran to Beirut, because there are a lot of Shias and can have a lot of alliances. And from the other perspective, Iran can influence all the territories from Tehran to Kabul because of the Persian identity. So it has this kind of dual identity, its foreign policy. The point is that every time that Iran is making a good movement, let's say like the agreement with China, that China is investing $400 billion into the relationship with Iran and is looking for an exit to West through Beirut and Latakia ports, we see that the United States already they have the response. So the Abraham Accords, actually they just trap Iran, and Iran now cannot go out from Beirut port or Latakia. Israel is striking Latakia. Beirut port is destroyed. Mm-hmm. And General Aoun, he refused the construction by Iran. So the whole perspective that I see is that it's not that Israel is everywhere. The point is that we see that Iran is nowhere at the moment. And what Iran, it was a big country 2 years ago. I mean, 2022, things, they seem quite bad. And the Vienna talks show that United States, they are not really interested in lifting the sanctions. Of course, they are going to lift some sanctions, but it's something really temporary. The United States, they don't have so much interest in Iran because Iran doesn't know how to invest in its foreign policy, and the people, they feel quite tired by this, Shia and Persian identity in the region. I don't know how you see this interaction of Iran.
I mean, internally in Iran, the sanctions have had a huge effect to the point where, like this week, we saw 120 cities protests come out of teachers on strike, joined by firefighters and members of the judiciary. Employees of the judiciary came out and they're protesting against the government and chanting against Raisi, calling him illiterate, saying, how can someone who didn't go to school govern schools? So there's a lot of anger, and we're seeing this again and again in Iran. And it's not just the sanctions; it's mismanagement. I followed the presidential campaign last year. I covered it for my university. I ran a radio program for it. And one of the things that kept coming up from all the candidates is they're talking about mismanagement. There's a general recognition that corruption, nepotism has undone a lot of things that could have been better if even under the circumstances of sanctions. So there's that internal problem. However, externally, with the with the Vienna negotiations, I don't know. I feel like the Iranians, quite rightly, haven't taken it as seriously because they don't trust that Trump is not going to come in or someone like him in a few years and do the exact same thing and remove it again. But they're looking for guarantees that actually it's going to be in place. In the meantime, Israel, under a new government, is like, well, the Iranians almost have a nuclear weapon now. If they don't have the capabilities, they're very close, and that's not going to stop through assassinations or anything else. So they missed the boat under Netanyahu to actually negotiate and get the Americans to put things forward for them. And although Israel has been putting pressure on Iran in Latakia and Beirut, they also recognize that under Netanyahu, they overstretched the war against Iran. That the maritime war is something that Iran can easily beat Israel at because they have more freedom in the seas than they do in other areas of the conflict between Israel and Iran. They have more power in that way. And recently we've seen Iran is constantly trying to infiltrate Israel. They tried to use the migrant community of Iranian Jews in Israel unknowingly to try and form something there that was broken up before it started anything. But Iran has not only, it hasn't been all bad news for Iran, and that arm wrestle is the way it's looked recently.
I was talking to a friend that he's doing security stuff in Brussels. So they're following Iran for a couple of years. So he said to me that the problem with Iran is that it's not that predictable anymore. I mean, we can predict Iran, so we know how Iran is moving from the legal part, from the politics part. So we can understand Iran now. I mean, Iran is not, the X factor in the whole equation in Middle East. The problem, as he explained to me, is that after the agreement with China, Iran is becoming an agent of Chinese foreign policy. Yeah. So the time that everything was against Iran, now they're against Iran much more because of the problem, and the war is against China. So now in Brussels, they do feel that Iran is again on the wrong camp, and they cannot get along with Iran very well, and they don't show so much interest from the time that they hit China. But also we see China that though it made the agreement with Iran an investment or promised investments into Iran, after the destruction of Beirut port and the strikes to Latakia port, Chinese do not feel safe to carry the whole products through Central Asia to Beirut or to Latakia, someone to strike it, probably Israel. So now Chinese, though they invested and they came into agreements with Iranians, they tried to bring their products to countries like Finland or close to Northern Europe, only through Russia in order to avoid political unsafety in Central Asia. So once again, Iran, we see that is making this kind of miscalculations. And my question is, what we shall supposed to expect from Raisi's government? It's almost 1 year after being elected.
Well, to start with the China agreement, which has been very opaque and is very sensitive. I mean, I'm not sure if you remember, the viewers remember when that was announced about 12 months ago, just under 12 months ago, there was all of this brouhaha about it because the details of it were never made public. And now recently it's actually come into effect. but the actual details of what it involves are not public to my knowledge. And there were some members of parliament who leaked some aspects of it and then quickly apologized and retracted it because they were under threat. And Rouhani also made a comment that in Iran, we've always sorted things out with consensus, so let's have a referendum if we need to have a referendum about it. And Hossein Shariat Madari of Tehran newspaper, which is close to the Supreme Leader, was calling for his prosecution for speaking against the China agreement. So there are those that are fully behind it and those that are suspicious, because the general feeling is that there is some loss of sovereignty for Iran in this agreement. But what that is, no one is able to say. So that it's controversial as well. And China, keeping in mind that China's interests and goals don't align with those that it's trying to ally with against the United States. Like Iran, China more than anyone would know that Iran is not predictable and that they can't necessarily guarantee everything for Iran. Also, that what Iran wants is not what China wants. So that is a problem for them. And China is, of course, a country that is growing and is breathing out. Now that the United States, after the financial crisis and then after Trump, started to withdraw, they are breathing out and trying to take some of that space, because that's what countries do. That's what international relations works like. So Iran is part of that. But Iran is a country where instability and volatility mean opportunity. So that's why their political system, and I'm not the first person to ever think this, seems from the outside to be so unpredictable, because it's beneficial for the different factions in Iran to have a little bit of instability. Now with Raisi, it's hard to see him as anything other than a caretaker president, but what he's a caretaker president for is hard to say. Some people say that he's a caretaker president for him becoming supreme leader when Khamenei, who through all rumors is very sick, passes away. But of course, they've been calling for his obituary, Khamenei's obituary, for more than 10 years now. So when that will happen, it'll happen suddenly, I'm sure, and will. But it may not happen tomorrow. It may not happen for 10 years, right? So what Raisi's up to, what his plans are for his presidency is hard to tell. However, there is a real turn to a much harder approach of Iran's government to civil society in some ways, because of the result of the sanctions and just the economic problems that the country faces. They need to put a lid on it if they want to maintain it. I think that's the way that they think, that it's not a case of that Iran is a country where there is negotiation on such issues. It's a zero-sum game. If I let you in, you're going to take over. So I'm not going to let you into this conversation, is the type of thinking that goes on there. And we've seen like huge amounts of trade union activism on levels that have previously not happened in the last couple of years. So it's not, of course, Raisi necessarily this is causing this, but there are a lot of problems that people are willing to risk their lives for. In terms of the general legitimacy of the Raisi government, the election was a bit of a joke, which for Iranian standards is, it says something. And the shooting down of the passenger plane before had also severely hurt after Soleimani died, after he was assassinated by the Americans, severely hurt the Iranian government's legitimacy. So what the Raisi government is going to do to patch that, I don't think they're really aiming to build a fabric between the societies. They're actually trying to stabilize some form of something with the government that will allow it to carry on and survive in future. Again, for decades, commentators have been calling for the demise, or saying that the demise of the Islamic Republic is going to happen very soon, but it never has happened. And so I'm not really one who thinks that the regime necessarily is teetering on collapse. But at the same time, I know, having worked in that sphere and spoken to people who work in work with the regime believers, that they're always mindful that if they aren't on top of things, that things will collapse. So anyway, that's I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, it was very interesting. That's why I didn't interrupt you. It was very interesting actually. James, we have a question by a friend that's asking, is there any human rights abuse against Armenians in Iran?
Um, you know, I remember, and I wrote about this in my book. I remember being at the genocide commemoration the first time I was in Iran, 2010 at Subsarkis. There's the cathedral. There's a monument to the Armenian genocide there, and the Archbishop complaining about Shirin Ebadi, and who's the Nobel Prize winner, about how she says that minorities are persecuted in Iran and how this was nonsense, and that here we are commemorating our genocide and so forth without interference. Look, there's human rights issues in Iran in general. I don't think that the Armenian community per se is targeted in any way that would say there's specific issues about Armenian human rights issues. Now, that said, overall legal status of Armenians, as with all minorities, are less than the other members of Iran. So they're second-class citizens in some aspects of law. However, on a day-to-day practical level, that doesn't really influence their life. So, I mean, I know that whatever I say in this case, if I come out on this show and say there are no human rights issues that are specific to Armenians, there are human rights issues in Iran, but none specific to Armenians, I'm going to get attacked by people saying you don't know what you're talking about. And if I say that, yes, there are specific Armenian issues because they're a minority community and they're not equal in status and they're treated this way and that way, then I'm going to get people from Armenians from Iran saying you don't know what you're talking about. So it's a lose-lose situation with that question. That said, with minority communities, the human rights abuses on Armenians are much more marginal than they are for other minority communities, particularly those that are not recognized. So the Sunni Muslim community has to deal with their seminaries being closed and their mosques being closed, people being arrested and so forth for illegally worshipping. That doesn't affect the Armenian community. The Yarsani and Baha'i communities are the same. The Iranian Christian community is the same. The Iranian Christian being those who've converted to Christianity. Interestingly, or importantly, the Armenian Christian denominations, including the Protestant denomination, have kept keep a distance from other Christian groups that aren't recognized as a result of pressure from the government. So it used to be the Armenian evangelical Protestant community, which I know reasonably well, that they were open to the Persian Christian churches. Now they're kind of closed off from them because two of their pastors were murdered as a result of it. Yeah, there is that. So look, the situation in Iran is that there are a lot of human rights violations. For the Armenian community, there are very few specific violations for that community there are very few violations that aren't affecting other communities in Iran as well. So they're not targeted for being Armenian, I guess is what I'm saying.
How it happened, because you mentioned that, and I found it very important, there are Iranians, Shia, I assume, that they've been converted to Christianism. So per se they cannot belong to the Armenian church, because the Armenian church they're Armenians because of the origin and not because of the religion. So do they have their own churches? For example, if an Iranian is becoming Christian Orthodox, they have their own church. If it's becoming Catholic Christian, they have their own churches, and these are religious. How does this work?
Yeah, they do have their own churches, and that, look, Armenians have a convenient rule, which has not come about because of this issue, but exists in the Armenian church, that they don't accept converts. That is, they only baptize people of Armenian ancestry because they say they're a national church. Now, sometimes for other Christians, that sort of surprises people because they think that the all Christian churches look at their mission as universal. But Armenians say, yes, our mission is universal, but go baptize yourself in another church. This one's for Armenians. So they do have that. Also, under government directives, they don't allow non-Armenians, apart from foreigners, into their compounds. So into their churches in particular. Everything is in Armenian. And if you walk into one of those compounds, usually someone will approach you if they don't know you and they'll speak to you in Armenian. And if you can't answer in Armenian, then they'll ask you to leave. They'll say, and they'll be polite about it. They'll say, look, we'd love to have you here, but because of the rules of this government, we can't let you into the church. And they're talking about Muslims in particular, who are sometimes just going to the church. And I've seen them come into the churches. They're interested in historical buildings. This is like their city, and they want to have a look at them. They're not coming to convert to Christianity necessarily. Although I did see once in 2015 a woman. I don't know how this happened, but she was in the during a liturgy, during a service. Suddenly, a Muslim woman. I use the term Muslim as in Iranian, not Armenian. She was trying to take communion in the church, and like a lot of religious Muslims used to go into the churches to light candles because they see Jesus and Mary as prophets and holy figures, and they would do that. So I think this woman was, I don't know if she was trying to convert, but she was engaging in a way that was a little bit unusual. And the priest having to refuse to give her communion and then asking her to please leave in the midst of the church service.
James, we need to mention that, sorry to interrupt you, we need to mention that, I mean, the Shias, they do believe that Jesus is a prophet, but they do expect that it's going to come with Mahdi. And Mahdi is the 12th Imam that is going to come the same time with Jesus. So Jesus and Mahdi, they have the same legitimation, let's say, within Shia religion. And as an Orthodox and study Shiism, I would say that because of the Persian and the Byzantium empires, so we have a lot of common aspects. For example, for me, it's easier to follow the Shia perspective when we talk about Islam than the Sunni, because I'm Greek, so we have a lot of commons. I mean, what we have, for example, in the Eastern Christian Church, and of course, what we have even in our history and mythology, exists in Shiism. So we'd say that yes, when I see Persians, for example, when we have Iranians here in Cyprus, I have seen many Iranians going to church, following the ceremony in the service. But also, I mean, light candles, or they stay there to pray. So they are Muslims, they are Shia. So I think there is this kind of convenience, and they feel that we're not far away from each other, probably.
Yeah, look, I've always found, so as someone who was raised in Irish background, raised in the Catholic tradition, and I know that people from Orthodox traditions are the same. You look at Shiism, and you think, wow, it's very Catholic, or it's very Orthodox in the use of iconography. The way that Ashura resembles Easter in the rituals in many ways, and in a lot of aspects there's similarities. Although over the years I have noticed that Shiism is not all the same, and I don't mean that in a banal sense. I mean, like, Shiism in Iran, Ashura in Iran is very melodramatic and emotional, and emotional in the sense that people are crying, they're upset. But then you see it in Iraq, and it's like angry. We're angry that this guy's been killed. We're angry. We want to hurt somebody. It's like the emotion is different in a way, and it's cultural. It's an Arabic-speaking place as opposed to a Azeri or Persian-speaking community. They're different. But yeah, I have noticed that a great deal in the similarities. Whereas, as you said, Sunni Islam, particularly certain types of Sunni Islam, seem much more dry, much more Protestant. They're like, look, if it's not in the book, we're not going to do it. That's their attitude. If it's not in the book, it's a deviation. I had a very good teacher, my Quran teacher. He's in Com. So this man, he helped me very much when I was studying Shiism. So he said to me, don't get confused. Shiism, it's Islam, but it's been influenced by the Persian wisdom and rationality. So he said to me, if you want to understand Shiism, just go and study Shahnameh. And I mean, this helped me at the end of the day. And look, you do get Iranians who will erroneously say, or say it like it's anachronistically, that Iranians didn't really want to become Muslim, so they became Shia because Shia is not really Muslim. But I mean, that's actually historically that's not true. But there's another reason why there's other reasons why Iran became Shia, and it only became Shia in recent centuries. But yeah, I have heard that, and look, that's true. Even Sunni Islam has all sorts of influences that Greek and Persian and others, which are kind of covered over and made Islamic a little bit more. But that's because you can't keep religion away from other cultural influences. Same with Christianity. Like there are all different cultural influences on Christianity. It is interesting though that in Zoroastrianism there's the tripartite system of good words, good thoughts, good words, good deeds. And I thought that's such a Catholic thing because in the Catholic Church when we do the have the gospel before the priest reads it, the congregation cross their forehead, their mouth, and their heart, and that is the pendore nik, goftore nik, kerodore nik. And I thought the influence of Zoroastrianism also is sometimes appreciated to the point where there is a theory, and I'm not going to give it endorsement necessarily here, that Zoroastrianism, the concept of heaven, comes from Zoroastrianism. Because if you look at the early books of the Bible and the original books of the Jewish tradition, there's no mention of an afterlife. You die, you go into the ground. That's it. And then later, this idea of heaven appears. So that heaven was introduced, this is the theory, introduced to Judaism and subsequently Christianity and Islam from Zoroastrianism. That's the idea. But I mean, I could talk about that stuff all day because it's fascinating. But you also, so for one final thing, there is a recognition that in Iran, in Shia Islam in Iran, that there's a strong Sufi influence in some ways. And that Sufi influence is not Sufi in just an Islamic sense. This reflects pre-existing, pre-Islamic traditions of spirituality or of relationships with spiritual beliefs that have existed for centuries in Indo-European and other Mesopotamian cultures and so forth.
Yeah, also there is a great Irfan influence as well. I mean, this kind of mysticism, and actually even when Khomeini was writing his first books, The Unveiled Secrets, he had a lot of mysticism in there, and he was trying to explain the Islamic governance and the relationship with the God through the perfect man. So he followed even more Platonic and ancient Greek or more philosophical, like Al-Farabi traditions. So I think that the whole system in Iran is something like mysticism, actual governance, and the relationship with the gods. It's something, of course, strange for us that we are more secular democracies, but still, I wouldn't say it's something bad, but generally it's something different from what we are used to. James, we have two last questions before our show is gonna end, and we're very happy that we had you today because we have received a lot of messages from people that they are commenting and they've been very happy for this discussion, because we brought up a topic that usually we don't talk about it, and so it's been very interesting for them. James, there is a question by a friend that how do Armenians react towards Shiism in Iran?
How do they react towards Shia practice?
Yes.
Well, look, I'm not going to say that there's one way that people react to it. The first thing I would say is that in all religious communities, you tend to look at other religious communities as in, it's a bit weird, let them do that, that's fine, but that's not our belief. And that tends to be the case. And Armenians are no exception to that.
Are there mixed weddings? I mean, I know that is not covered by the law, but in case of mixed weddings, is supposed one of the two to be converted?
Yeah, in a case of where an Armenian marries a Muslim, if it's Armenian woman marrying a Muslim man, then there's no need for a conversion. But if the other way around, the man has to convert, and that's it's a very taboo topic in Armenian communities because you're seen as losing your Armenianness if you convert. To be an Armenian is to be a Christian, even if you're not religiously a Christian. And this comes down to the word Armani in Persian is synonymous with Christian. Armenian, it means both. Yeah, that's a very sensitive topic. But look, in the way that they view Shiism, you do find some people who are, I guess, a little bit more open-minded, and their attitude is live and let live. And that Islam has a lot of good things about it that you can learn from. The same as Christianity has a lot of good things, and if people talk more openly with each other, then they will be fine. Then you do have a lot of people who are just sick of having religion publicly in the streets all the time, especially at times like Ashura and Ramadan, where it can interfere with your daily life. If you're not part of the religion, then you really become aware that you are a minority at those points in time. But that said, I have seen Armenians during Ashura making fun of the Sinezani, the hitting themselves. But I've seen more Muslim Iranians making fun of that or making jokes about Ashura than I have seen Armenians making jokes about Ashura. Because, like with any religious society, when religion is permeating all aspects of culture, it also ends up being the topic of a lot of jokes, even if those jokes are taboo, because that's how a lot of humor, a lot of comedy is satirizing culture. And especially, in Catholic societies, you see that, and you also see it in Iran as well.
James, our last question: how do you see the relationships between Iran and Armenia to go along the next 2 years?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because I more than anyone else can't predict things. But what I would expect is that Iran is going to push to try and maintain that relationship as openly as possible without interference from Azerbaijan or Turkey. A change will come, I think, if Turkey and Armenia do agree on on opening their border. That will be a difficult decision because of what
genocide.
If Armenia has to concede. There's a red line on that one. The genocide, like the Armenians are not going to say there was no genocide, but that is a difficult one. But that would also reshape where Armenia sits in relationship to Iran, and Iran and Turkey being big local competitors with each other. But I guess the short answer is I would expect Iran to do everything that they can to maintain that channel, because Iran has few friends, and Armenia, is not the best friend to have, but it's a friend. A friend is a friend in that situation.
It's a loyal friend all these years.
And Armenia is going to want to have Iran because they've been able to rely on Iran since their independence 30 years ago.
James, it's been a pleasure to have you tonight. It's morning in Melbourne. It's Monday morning. It's been lovely to have you here. We receive a lot of comments, a lot of questions by our friends and people that have been very interested into this topic. I think that we are going to have probably a new show close to summer with some other academicians about Iran and Middle East. So we'll be happy to invite you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for this, for being with us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for all of you that you participated actively in this show and you sent your questions and your comments. It's been a pleasure. We are going to see us next Sunday at 9 o'clock Greek time. We're going to have 3 academicians from Greek, and we will discuss in the Greek language about the foundation of the Greek state after the Greek Revolution in 1821. So, James, we will see us soon. I wish all the best in Melbourne. In case that you are in Middle East and especially in Cyprus or Greece, we'll be happy to see you and have a show live close to each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice week, and wish everybody to stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.